Okay, and let me ask real quick. I'm more than happy to kind of take questions as we go. Is that a good format from your perspective also?
Yes.
All right, cool. And I'm gonna actually leave it like this because I may jump around. I'm not gonna just deck you guys. So like, depending on which direction folks are interested in taking, we can go there.
Okay.
But no, I really appreciate everybody jumping on. Um, kind of looking through who's here, and I know I definitely some familiar faces. But wanted to give an introduction in general to this like way overpacked and overused piece of terminology these days, which is virtual power plants. It was frankly internally we kind of joked that it was just a couple of years ago that like we were internally debating words like, does anybody understand what the hell we're talking about if we say demand flexibility, and is virtual power plant actually a thing? And now it's everything, and that's part of the problem. Um, but uh, but we can kind of dig in. So just by way of a little bit of background, I'm you may have I'm a little bit of an outsized presence in a very small world, and I guess what you call X or whatever it is, but in the kind of energy Twitter and LinkedIn and all of that, but kind of been at this for a while. My personal background, after doing a bunch of work across various facets of tech during the .com and the dot boom and the dot bust, actually made a leap over to solar, and helped build the first megawatt in California back when it was $9 a watt, actually, in the right under the Orville Dam. That was not that long ago, actually, that it was $9 a watt. But kind of rode the solar coaster, and I made this crazy idea that I wanted out of solar because it was too volatile. So I went over to efficiency, which looking back is a complete joke. But we basically got the bug on the idea that why are we building so much solar on buildings that have incandescent lights and all of, and just bleeding every direction, data or energy in all directions. And so my first incarnation, and this is I'm giving this information kind of because it's very much seeds how we approach the market. Recurve 1.0, which was if you Google Recurve, you'll find a previous version. We were actually a home performance contractor, and so I've cut my teeth on running crews and selling to customers and doing HVAC and solar and all of these things, and even a whole bunch of electrification before it was cool. Heat pumps are not actually a new idea. So what we think of as virtual power plants and Recurve today kind of came out of that, and which is saying, if we're going to go after demand side resources, and this was a period of time originally where we didn't have smart meters, and the system peak in California was definitely 1 p.m. right? And that's not that long ago. Again, we're talking like 12 or 15 years ago. It was 1 p.m. in the afternoon. We all knew was the peak, and this duck curve was just a study. So a lot of those same ideas persist that came out of that, and some of the, and I think play really important role in a virtual power plant. So the first was, rather than kind of a bespoke world where every technology is signing contracts with individual contractors, individual utilities, and it's dominated by kind of these one-to-one contracts and programs. We need more of a market-based approach, get paid for outcomes, really like everything else that you see out there. If you're building a power plant, et cetera, you're not getting paid in advance based on what you think. So you could say that's part of capacity. And then, focusing on creating a marketplace, and a big part of that, which we'll get into, is flexibility is not something you can measure. It has to be calculated. So really what we'll look at when you kind of look at where Recurve is up to, where we're not a virtual power plant, we are a platform. And essentially we're trying to fill in the missing components in this industry that you'll find just about everywhere else, which is, how do we measure? What is a standard weights and measures? How do you know what flexibility is? How do you agree to that? How do you make that something that grid planners can rely on, and that you can forecast? And that if, different companies or different M&V providers measure the same stuff, you're going to get the same answer. This is kind of the baseline. And then using that to make a market for what we think of as virtual power plants today. We'll kind of get into that. So I'm going to start at kind of a rudimentary level. I think you're all I see a bunch of you guys are fellow energy nerd travelers, but we'll start at the basics, which is just this concept that the whole grid has been built around supply. There's demand for energy. We're going to put wires in of increasingly large sizes. We're going to build more power plants. We're going to make sure there's enough electrons to keep the lights on at every point in the grid and every hour of the day. And the kind of first point, we've been talking about, energy efficiency and demand response as the first fuel and all of that, and as a resource for all these years, but we really hasn't behaved like one, honestly, historically, or up to a large degree, even currently. But, this concept that aligning demand with when the supply is clean and cheap is equivalent to or identical to adding supply in those hours. And that, as we decarbonize the grid and it gets more and more volatile, there's an enormous potential resource that we can tap in both long-term load shaping, which is a form of capacity. You could call that energy efficiency. It's all the same thing. And also responsive, elastic demand response, things like, changing the set temperature on a thermostat or, discharging a battery. But all of these things behind the meter enable buildings to participate in the grid and actually align, again, when energy is used with when it is clean. And that can be through reductions in consumption, insulating an attic during with an air conditioner will bring you long-term peak reductions. It could also be, again, it's an emergency, turn up your thermostat during an event and we'll pay you a bunch for it. And that's actually why Recurve in our logo has these 3 lines in our, it's actually a homage to this idea of it's identical to, it's the same darn thing. So, the grid, as I was saying, is just like fundamentally changing. This is all, I'm sure, very rudimentary, but we're moving from these big, consistent resources, many of which can be throttled to at least some degree, to a much more complicated distributed infrastructure of EVs and solar and storage and heat pumps and controllable thermostats and refrigeration systems. And I could just keep going on and on and on, right? It's on the demand side, it is super, super distributed and complicated. And so this is a fundamental transition that mirrors a lot of what's going on in other sectors as well, which is moving from central command and control hub and spoke approach to a much more complex distributed approach to managing energy. And that's especially true behind the meter. That's one of the conditions that we all have to think about, which is, can you do this on the left, hub and spoke control of every single end use, or is it going to be a lot more distributed and frankly complex, but more self-organizing? So really big change in the, there's this energy transition going on, but like not just moving to clean energy, but a very different type of resources on the grid that need a different way of thinking about them and controlling them, right? This centralized, we're going to put everything on a CRT. I'll tell you my personal opinion, this is not fact, but I am pretty sure I own everything in my house on my side of the meter, for example. And I'm not so sure I want to let my utility dictate the temperature of my bedroom while I'm sleeping or how many miles I'm allowed to drive. So there's this interesting kind of philosophical question of like, where is the edge of the utility monopoly and where does private industry and customer choice kind of enter the equation? And from our perspective, that's the meter. Like we're pretty sure that is the edge of the grid, but there are different perspectives on that. We can talk about it. So importantly, again, this is not just some lefty righty coast thing anymore. This is, I think, a pretty exciting statistic, but I keep having to go back actually because the statistics keep changing so rapidly. Actually, this is from SEPA, but 75% of US customers are served by a utility with a 100% carbon reduction goal, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And so this is like a big pervasive change that's driving the need for virtual power plants. And then, California, we're the craziest. I know every place is not California, but we're a good harbinger of what is to come in a lot of places, though these load shapes will look different depending on the resource mix, wherever you are around the country. But there is no place that doesn't have a peak. The Pacific Northwest is much flatter. They have all this hydro, but at the same time, there is a difference between winter morning low, where their peaks are and the rest of the year. Like there's always this variation. And of course, the duck curve in California, we're dipping below zero because of too much solar production. We're actually in this trough, the belly of the duck, we're curtailing like a quarter of our solar and about half of our gas. The gas is flexible, but not that flexible because we have to keep it hot to respond to the peak. So, this basic dynamic is the fundamental change, which is, we want to use the energy and shift the energy when it's abundant and clean, and we're actually like paying other states to take it from us. And we want to use definitely less of it during the system peaks when it is dirty and expensive. And that's, $2,000 megawatts when the power is going to go off, but that's also just peaks every single day, which are shifting later and later. The system peak in California is 8 and 9 p.m. right now, and it's forecasted to actually push out, which is very much thanks to our friend storage, which is now having a pretty big impact. That's why you're seeing this peak drop. And then my last piece of remedial grid is just the fact that, again, it's not a coastal thing. We hear a lot about California and Texas with our various problems, but the grids across the country is under stress. And this actually equates to, if you add it all up, the difference between supply and demand, it's about 67 peak gigawatt hour delta. So one way to just kind of prospectively think about that is California, we've been fighting over our Diablo nuclear power plant, which is 2.2 gigawatts. So already there's, if this was all to be coincidental, which of course it won't, but there's like a 30 Diablo nuclear power plant supply and demand gap across these grids this summer. So that's my little bit of background. And again, when we talk about virtual power plants and demand side, it is not an exclusion of anything else. We're going to need absolutely everything. And we're also going to need the demand side. So, if you're thinking, what about storage and what about transmission and all of that? I think my answer to that, what about offshore wind and all of that would be like, yes, and it's not a competition. We are short on balancing resources, period. So we need all of them. And the kind of advantage to the demand side is there are no internet connection queues. It can be deployed rapidly, which we're proving. It also helps customers reduce cost on their actual bills instead of just continuing to build new rate base, infrastructure that gets turned into affordability issues. So our basic thesis is when we can do flexibility with virtual power plants, we absolutely should if it's cheaper than the marginal cost or even on par with the marginal cost of the alternatives, because it's deployable and it also helps the customer mitigate their own costs at the same time, which is unique. So I'm going to give you kind of the real quick on Recurve, but this won't be a sales pitch, but we kind of do two fundamental things. One, we work with utilities and regulators to look at all their meter data, figure out things like which customers have crappy air conditioners or who would be a good candidate for a heat pump, to where you would actually see them save on their bills and improve and have a good impact on the grid, for example. We call that resource planning, which is just really figuring out if you have a problem on a part of your grid, on a feeder, who are the customers doing it and why, and being able to forecast different DERs that might have an effect on those customers as a kind of a precursor to actually doing something about it. Also included in that is the ability to measure all these DERs in a consistent way. And that's kind of the role that Recurve is playing in this, is like those standard weights and measures, right? How do you measure, and this is kind of the problem that we'll talk about, which is very much a procurement problem, which is step 2, which is what we call flex market, which is the traditional way of going about solving these problems might be a utility running an RFP saying, who's going to fix this problem for me? And picking a large utility implementer or a technology provider. And the question I'd ask is, if a utility does a deal with Nest, I happen to have EcoVees, do I just get excluded from that? We actually have a CCA that just did a deal with Tesla. There's nothing wrong with their deal, but I happen to have Enphase in my house. Am I just shit out of luck? And where does this end? And that's kind of what we're seeing, is just like there are, at Recurve anyways, like we're finding new technologies and business models, which is every day, which is amazing. And so how do we let that innovation into the market and avoid this kind of picking winners and creating a patchwork quilt from an addressable market standpoint? So the second part of our business is, if you can find where the opportunity is, which customers will actually have a good impact if you put in a smart thermostat or a heat pump or a commercial refrigeration system, how do we streamline the ability of these virtual power plants? And that's the virtual power plant we think of as the company going out and engaging a customer and installing whatever it is, or engaging that customer whatever way works to respond to the grid. And so we think of ourselves very much as a platform for these virtual power plants, and providing kind of the fundamental components that you'll find in any market: consistent measurement across everything in a standard way, just like you got an appraiser on your house that's a third party, or a FICO score, or Standard & Poor's. We need consistency. Every single vendor can't have their own secret way of measuring. That really defies the ability to securitize or aggregate. And it makes it so, frankly, grid side planners don't believe our stuff, which is very much what we're hearing. They're like, we love demand response. We don't truly believe it's actually there. To large degree, they're wrong in that it is there, but they're right that they can't necessarily have confidence in the data they're seeing, because you can't due diligence it, source it, recreate it. It's very much a black box to them. So creating that marketplace for virtual power plants that lets folks engage, and going back to kind of where I started, paying for outcomes as opposed to technologies. So anybody that can get customers to do stuff that also delivers grid impacts and get paid for those values. So again, kind of, I won't get into this, like we'll just jump over this, but like I was saying, from a product suite, what Recurve does is looking at all the grid meters on the grid, for example, for utilities, but also regulators, and doing that from the ground up, each customer, each meter endpoint, so that you can actually disaggregate it. Again, like the secrets here are like, if you want to do heat pumps in California, it's not that many customers that will actually save, but you're looking for low heating load, high air conditioning load customers, right? And being able to pinpoint them is the difference between a high performing and a low performing program. In general, we find that from all DER, top 25% of the customers are going to deliver 75% of your impact. So being able to identify who those customers are in advance is incredibly important. And then once you install something, be able to measure it all in a consistent way so that you can, regardless of what brand thermostat, or what heat pump you're using, or, any of those attributes, being able to use smart meter data to say, how did you affect demand at these meters, both for energy efficiency and demand response? And then how do you account for that so everybody can get paid and you can do diligence it? And you can also forecast it so that you can integrate these virtual power plants into the demand forecast, and also forecast your cash flows so that you can invest in, behind the meter infrastructure for the grid and pay for it like an actual power plant based on those cash flows from delivering performance to the grid. And there's just a ton of low-hanging fruit. This is just an example of drilling down and saying, like, can we find the customers in this case that have 37% air conditioning load instead of 11%? And if you target these individual customers, in this case, this is a demo view, but 194 customers, they'll have vastly larger impacts on peak than the average customer. And in many cases, like we're running actually in MCE territory, we run a market focused on residential heat pumps. And without this targeting, it's just non-economical, right? The average customer doesn't have an air conditioner in Marin County, for example. So if you install a heat pump, you're net bad for the grid by adding peak load in the summer. So on average, you install a heat pump in MCE territory, it's going to deliver like maybe $500 or $600 in grid value over its lifetime, which doesn't make any sense. But if you target the top 15% of customers that are in the hot climates that have bad air conditioners, those customers are worth $4,000 or $5,000 to the grid in impact. So being able to do that is just really critical. So that's kind of the base technology. And again, I'll get into this a little bit more, but one thing that is really important is that, like, how we implement is one thing. Like, how do you run analysis on every single meter on the grid is kind of a technical challenge, but the code and methods that we use are all open source. And that's been a key component of Recurve from the get-go, which is, if we're going to have a market, we're obviously competing in our own space, but you can't have secret M&V and measurement. You need consistent, reproducible ability to quantify impact that is not exclusive to any one party, that is agreed to in advance, right? With both the methods and the implementation. And that's why so all of the core mathematics and the code that we run is all part of the Linux Foundation. You can get there actually through our website, it links out, but it's all totally open source. So anybody can run it with some technical acumen, right? Like, it's not running it millions and millions of times has a different challenge, but it's a Python based and fully available, and it is under an Apache 2 license, which says anybody can use it for any purpose without restriction. And we think that is critically important, that it's not a secret. So Recurve does this stuff, but if you want to know how we do it, it's all out there. And we can, instead of debating who's right philosophically, we can say, well, this is exactly what we did. If you've got a better way to do it, we should talk, because these methods are always being improved publicly through a process. There's one going on right now, but we're not just going to argue over different ways to do math after the fact, right? We've agreed to it. We call this a revenue grade calculation because you can put it in a contract, and we say, this is how we're going to do it, and you can litigate that. So getting to like the actual meat of it, this is some analysis that kind of, just to give some framing, this is the 2020 blackouts. We were doing some work with the CAISO. And also with NREL and MCE and a few folks like Ohm Connect. And just to give you an example, one of the type of work Recurve does relative to a virtual power plant is just literally this open source is the measurement to start with. And so this is an example of a demand response event, just to give you a sense, just to put some meat on the bone, what we're actually talking about. This is during that 2020 where we had blackouts. We were also measuring 2021, but 2020 was a bigger deal because, like, if you guys recall, the grid was shutting down. So it's like 105 degrees. And the red is actually the forecasted baseline that comes out of the flex meter, which is where, our open source tooling that lets us do both long-term load flexibility and demand response. And the blue is actually the response of this set of, in this case, I'm pretty sure these were thermostats during the event period. And of course, the black is the savings delta that's occurring. And so for demand response, we work with KISO and others. It's just we have a more sophisticated baselining method, which utilizes something called the time of week temperature model, which is actually the same basic math we use for both long-term and dispatchable baselines, with a comparison group of non-participants. And frankly, I don't have something I can exactly show, but the difference between these flex meter methods and like the traditional demand response measurement methods, like a 10 by 10 or a 5 by 10 baseline, is stark. They're frankly, like, we agree that we think demand response in E is absolutely real and very valuable, but we need a bet. Like, if you're on the outside, you're working for an ISO or a utility to procurement department, you have every right to be skeptical that the impact is actually arriving in the way that it's being measured. And again, it's not to say it's not there. It's to say that our method, like the mathematics behind our ability to quantify it, has been pretty basic and leaves a lot to be desired when you really dig into it. So one is just this ability, again, to utilize open methods. I can get into how that works if you guys want to go down that road. The other, and this is really important, is what we think of as a complete virtual power plant. Yes. Sorry, I just don't see who's talking. Benjamin.
No worries. Is there, I was actually going to ask you if you could touch on base loads and what it is, how, or baselines, I mean, how that's calculated, just like a quick baseline for newbies. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of, you know what, I'm realizing I don't have, let me, I'm going to pull up, this is on the fly here because I'm realizing I don't really have the, I'm going to stop for 1 second. I'm going to pull up a different deck that just has a little bit of a baseline for newbies that I can show. So let me this will make that, if I'm going to go down this road, this will make than just trying to do it verbally here. So let me through here. Excellent. All right, quick switch. All right, so let me just jump real quick where I left off, and then I will go through the how. So before I get into like the technical, just like how the methods work, which is really not rocket science ultimately, at a higher level, I wanted to touch on what a virtual power plant actually is. So a lot of if you read the recent McKinstry report on virtual power plants, and a lot of the talking about virtual power plants is saying, like, look, VPPs are synonymous with control and dispatch, right? That it's essentially demand response is a virtual power plant. And we love demand response, don't get me wrong, but actually we think that virtual power plants look a lot like the grid itself, right? And so if you look at the mix of power supply on the grid, it's predominantly like 90+% of it is either base load or load following resources, right? Things like nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, these are resources that have some flexibility, but something like solar tracks with insolation, sun, right? And wind tracks with when the wind blows. And frankly, on top of those like large stable assets, there's a very small percentage of peaky assets, right? Like diesel generators, natural gas peak plants that we turn on in emergencies, right? And so the grid is primarily comprised of these baseload and load following resources with this like icing on the top of emergency dispatch. And we think virtual power plants are very much the same thing, right? So energy efficiency can be, I'm just going to say it, kind of boring in its traditional, like we're chasing megawatt hours with insulation. But if you just turn the page on that, you realize that all of that energy efficiency creates load shape impacts, right? If you insulate an attic with an air conditioner, you're getting savings consistently when it's hot out. And if it happens to be a heat pump, or in general, you're also probably getting it when it's cold too, right? It's not dispatchable, but it is consistent and creates a load shape impact. And I would posit absolutely everything you do in a building creates a load shape impact. There is no like there's an NREL graphic where they show efficiency just being a flat reduction, and we don't see that anywhere, right? Even if you put in a new refrigerator, you're going to get savings if you can measure it, which you probably can't deep, but like if you could, more savings are going to happen around meal times when you're opening the door, right? To some marginal degree, no flat. So we think of these efficiency resources as long-term load modifying resources. that look a lot like a load following resource for the most part, right? Insulating attics, replacing HVAC, even lighting, you're going to save when the lights are on, right? And that's a lot like the bulk of the grid. And it actually represents the bulk of the potential in virtual power plants are not, the computerized fancy controls at the very end or dispatch. It's infrastructure investments that improve utility of the building, which is also one of the benefits of the long-term stuff, is actually makes customers, buildings better. Whereas demand response, you're giving something up, which is fine, but that's what's happening, right? You're willing to be hotter than you might want to be and change for some money. So we think like essentially the opportunity, the long-term predictable stuff is the bulk of the opportunity on a day, which is like what your thermostat could do every day. And if I can use an example here, if we only pay for peak events, like in California, we had an emergency, the ELRP program, the Emergency Load Response Program. And there were only 11 events last year. And those events were super lucrative, but there were only 11 of them, right? And we're paying $2 a kilowatt. But what happens the rest of the time? And when you look at like whether it's storage systems in your garage or smart thermostats, what we actually want from a policy perspective is, and this is a quote from our friends at the regulator, is they don't want stuff that is just dispatching during emergencies. They want used and useful virtual power plants. And that's just a quote from that's the regulatory terminology, which means we don't want to just pay to build fire stations. That's like the capacity thing. We want fire stations that roll trucks, meaning we're utilizing these assets, not just during emergencies, but to load shape all year long. And right now, in the way that we've siloed energy efficiency demand response in this conversation, the incentive is actually, for the most part, to not dispatch and wait around for emergency events, because energy efficiency on non-event hours actually reduces your demand response payment. So what we really want actually is that thermostat doing as much load shaping every day as a customer will put up with, and which leaves a smaller amount during an event. But if they're getting paid every day, they're winning actually, because there's a lot. The long-term load shaping is less valuable on a per unit basis, but there's way more of it. Like in California, the peak is actually only 6.5% of the hours in the year, right? But there's value in load shaping across the year. So when we talk about a virtual power plant, we want to integrate a long-term price signal with emergency event response. And that long-term price signal, again, that load modifying resource is a hedge against capacity, which means if I'm a utility and I can encourage my customers through any means possible to flatten the load shape all year, that means I have less capacity I have to buy. I might not have to replace a substation. In California, we call it resource adequacy. There's literally none of it to buy anymore. The market is like empty. There's not enough of it even available. So we want to load shape all year long. And then during an event, we want to be able to isolate specifically for the additional impact from the demand response event signal. And so I'll get into kind of how our methods work in a second, but one of the things we're able to do is create an initial baseline for the smart thermostat, and I will dig in right after this to what that means. So looking at the year prior to installing it, I'm just gonna use that as an example, that says, how did the smart thermostat affect demand every hour of the day throughout the year on a consistent basis? And if you can reduce during the peaks, in California, we have something called the avoided cost calculator that has recently, we now call it total systems benefit, but it's the same thing that just sits on top of our avoided cost values, which gives us, and I could point you guys to where to look for this, but we have capacity, energy, GHG, T&D, ancillary services values for each hour of the entire year, and it's forecasted out 40 years. And that's the underpinning for how we do grid planning here in California anyways. It's also NEM3 and everything else, right? Is sitting on this common forecast of like, what are the grid values going forward, which is critically important for planning, right? And so that the avoided cost value is the kind of long-term forecasted value. And then we can measure that and say, like, what was the change in demand because of that thermostat all year long? And what is that worth avoiding these long-term costs? And that's, again, hedging the capacity investments that might otherwise have to be made. And then during an event, we will take the event, we will look back 60 days and create a secondary baseline, which is forecasting how would that thermostat normally work when it's 100 degrees in July. And that allows us to parse out the event window between long-term effect and the additional impact from the signal, if that makes sense. So we're creating a secondary baseline that says, here's what a thermostat would have just normally done today. But Now you're paying $2 a kilowatt hour because it's an emergency. So normally that thermostat would save 5 kilowatts this hour is our baseline, our calculation. But today you save 14. So if that's the case, 5 of it you pay at the long-term rate, and the additional 9 kilowatt so that you save that hour, that's your event response. You pay at the demand response rate, which is much higher. And this allows these things to merge together. And so I guess the sum of that long-winded approach is that we think a virtual power plant is the combination of capacity and energy, long-term, consistent, load following resources like insulation, which blows people's mind. Insulation is a key part of a virtual power plant. And then also include the event response on top. And what you find is that events response is really valuable, but it's not much of it. And it's not a huge component of the potential in the market. Now, in terms of the tools, and you can definitely go to the Recurve website. There's an open source tab that just links out to all this stuff if you want to find these resources, so I don't have to give you URLs. But there's a series of tools that are, again, open source. The first 2 are in the Linux Foundation. The next 2 are going to join those first 2 some point this year when we get the bandwidth. They are fully open source, by the way, and supported. We just haven't committed the code over to Linux Foundation yet, which is basically administrative. We have to have the bandwidth. But CalTrack and OpenE Meter are actually 2 parts of the same whole. CalTrack is the methods, and the OpenE Meter is a Python implementation of those methods that uses monthly, daily, or hourly data, and it can actually go sub-hourly if necessary, to model the performance of the building relative to temperature and occupancy patterns. Though soon we're going to be adding insulation and a few other pretty exciting bells and whistles. And that's actually just getting underway. So if you're interested in nerdy out on the tech, we have a CalTrack 3.0 process that's, I think, kicking off officially August 1st. But what that allows us to do is create a baseline that predicts how a building would function under those conditions, so that we can forecast it and we can measure against that baseline. And frankly, it's a little surprising sometimes how much, if you can ascertain occupancy condition and temperature, how predictive that is, in fact, of energy use in the building. GridMeter is a tool that creates a comparison group of non-participants automatically. It looks at each individual customer and it matches those customers to non-participants that look like them in how they use energy and sector and a few other variables. So we end up with, and then we can actually do a secondary calculation and say, this was critically important during COVID, but it's also critically important, for example, during emergency event response, where you have flex alerts on the radio and all sorts of stuff, which we're able to look and say, how much of what we're measuring is just happening in the population, right? COVID, people were staying home from work, commercial buildings weren't just saving a ton of energy. They were, they looked like it if you just looked at the building, but if you compared it to their peers, a lot of those savings went away, for example, right? And that's also true during emergency event response. The initial ELRP program in California, we paid people based on savings at the meter. When they went back through and did a comparison group, almost all of those savings evaporated. People were saving anyways, whether they're part of the program or not, because of alerts on the radio and everything else. Flex value is a tool that converts the results of these two, the load shape impact, what we call resource curve. How did you affect demand every hour? And it converts that into essentially avoided cost or money and cost effectiveness. This is a tool that's actually, we're in the process working with the PUC to adopt that officially in California as a cost effectiveness tool. But it's particularly designed to utilize hourly data and utilize real load shapes, not deemed load shapes. And it's extensible anywhere. To begin with, we have it loaded in California with our avoided cost stack. But as we work with CCAs or utilities that have more granular marginal hourly values, that can be replaced. So it's a very extensible tool. So this is how do you get to the load shape impact that this had. This is how you turn that into money and grid value. And then differential privacy is a technique that we deploy that privatizes large data sets. I'm not going to dive into that, but if you're a privacy nerd, it's pretty cool, which is a way to inject noise into data sets so that you can actually use them while protecting the individual privacy of each customer in the data set. It's a much more sophisticated way to do it than the 10 by 100 base, aggregations and things that are out there, especially with smart meter data, can be broken. And so this is a much more mathematically sophisticated approach to maintaining privacy, which is really critical when you're dealing with population data in particular. So, from a methodological standpoint, essentially and this is a DR event, but we're looking at first the baseline of the individual customer during a period. So again, we're using the OpenE meter to look at and create a regression model of how that customer uses energy relative to occupancy condition and temperature. And then we generate, for each of those customers, we generate a comparison group of non-participants that match their consumption profiles. We put those all into a bucket, and then we measure each of those customers, we measure the same thing. How did their usage change during that event window? And then we difference those differences. And the net result is the flexibility in that hour, net of what would have just happened anyways if you just let folks, do what they would have done. So that's kind of the methodological approach. What's important here is you can not only get a very robust number that is reliable and something we can verify, but we also have confidence intervals around that. We know how good it is, which is the critical thing, by the way, when it comes to forecasting, is to be able to discount properly. We don't have to be perfect, and that's especially true in each individual asset in a population. But we need to be able to quantify our uncertainty so that you can discount the resource properly. And that's kind of one of the most important things we find is that these resources are extremely stable, and they are something you can rely on. Not individual assets. Like some people will go and have a new baby, and kids will go to college, or some restaurants will change their operating hours. But across a portfolio, this is a incredibly reliable resource, right? And it's something that can be forecasted, and frankly, it can often be more reliable than a power plant, because if you've got 5,000 thermostats, it's actually really hard to disrupt what you're going to get out of that, right? You're not going to have catastrophic failure across all those customers generally. So the last thing I'll mention, and then we can chat, is so in 2021, the governor of California, Governor Newsom, declared an emergency summer reliability order, which went out to all of the agencies in California, said, like, we need to keep the lights on. You got to figure out something to do about this. And which frankly has resulted in a lot of new gas generation and even diesel generators running during peaks, for example, because at the end of the day, keeping the lights on is king. So part of that is that the PUC went two directions. One is they created the emergency ELRP program, the emergency demand response program. And then the other program they implemented was something called market access, which was based on a design that Recurve had been working on with some of our CCA customers, MCE in particular, which was a way to deploy. You could think of it as energy efficiency. Again, we think of it as demand flexibility, because it's not monthly. It's focusing on long-term, implementing projects that can reduce, flatten the load shape generally, with a focus on summer peak over a long-term period of time, non-dispatchable resources. So the goal, fundamentally was 4 to 9 p.m. in the summer is where we're having the issue. But again, the hours of 8 and 9, those are our net peak hours with the greatest value. And, the value can either be load shifting, pre-cooling a building, moving out, heating up your water, floating through the summer, the peak period. It can also be reductions, insulating an attic, turning off lights, or putting in new bulbs, et cetera. And I'll touch on this because lights is a good example of we've actually heard this, you can't fix summer peak with commercial lighting. Commercial lighting peaks in the middle of the day, which is true on average in many cases, but not true if you go find the people using the lights during the peak, the average doesn't matter, which is a bit of a, we get a very different result, because if you incentivize people to save during peak, the companies will go figure out how to do that. They're not just going to go for the average, because that's where the money is. So the way flex market works is actually really logical and simple, and looks essentially like the base case for any market on earth at the end of the day. So there are a couple key differences. So first, Recurve contracts with aggregators. And we're doing this in a lot of reasons to solve a procurement problem for the utility. We're essentially neutral. And we think there are, again, hundreds and really thousands of different business models and technologies out there. We think utilities are not the right ones to pick the winners through an RFP. So our approach is we sign a flexibility purchase agreement with these aggregators, whether they're, residential heat pumps, commercial refrigeration, or lighting. Like I'll give you a sense of who's out there. You can look it up online. There's a lot of different companies because we are agnostic to their approach, and we want to leave them alone to develop their own business models with their customers and their own tech stack and their own approaches. So these aggregators sign up and they go out and engage customers in whatever way works for them. We're not going to tell them how to do that, right? And they get customers to install their BMS system or insulate their attic or upgrade their refrigeration systems or whatever. They enroll those customers into the flex market. We do all the basic crap of like checking for dual enrollments and stuff like that. But we say, all right, this customer is eligible. We can baseline them. Now we'll start measuring them and tracking them. And so rather than paying some sort of rebate up front to the customer, we measure how the energy is being, how demand is changing for that customer. And what was that load shape impact, which we call resource curve. And then using that flex value engine, we convert that into the value to the grid in terms of capacity, energy, T&D, GHGs, which can all be bundled together or they can be disaggregated depending on who your counterparties are, right? In California, a lot energy capacity usually rolls up, or like half the time rolls up to a CCA, whereas T&D rolls up to the investor-owned utility. But we figure out what was the effect of this virtual power plant. You just went out and installed, 5,000 thermostats with heat pumps. What was the load shape impact of that and what is it worth? And then the utility pays the aggregator, sometimes through us, sometimes not. We're kind of agnostic there too, for the grid impact that their aggregated virtual power plant is delivering, what that value is. So we're essentially cleaving the virtual power plant value off from the customer benefits, right? Customers don't buy T&D savings for PG&E with their own money, right? But they buy comfort and lower energy bills. So that's what the aggregator is selling them. And we're taking that grid value that isn't accruing to the customer, right? Is accruing to a utility or a different counterparty, and say, when we monetize that, that's the virtual power plant, right? Part of like you can set, there's like a part of what that project that is value to the grid. There's part of the project that is value to the customer. And then we pay the aggregator for that. And the aggregator then utilizes that to compete and generate a better business model that drives more demand and good behavior. But we align the incentives. That's the critical part. And I see your hand. I'll get to that in one sec. But I'll say that a lot of this came to me when I was at Recurve 1.0, running a retrofit business in a utility program, thinking to myself, well, the utility program was making my margins worse by increasing competition and overhead. And we were doing, we had blower doors and infrared cameras and engineers. And I'm looking at my financials, realizing my incentive is to juice my numbers on the front end to get my customer a bigger rebate, and then fire all my engineers and sell my blower doors and do cheaper work on the back end. Because if you pay me based on a model or on average, the way I make more money is not do better work, but is to cut my cost of goods sold. And we didn't actually do that, but it cost us, right? The program based on averages trends towards the companies that have the greatest margins, which means the lowest cost, which is exactly the opposite of what we actually want. So in a performance-based market, and we'll get to some of the metrics here, we pay for what's actually delivered. So the incentive is get customers to do stuff and then make sure it actually works, right? Both in terms of what you're installing and how you're doing it, but also, is this going to work for the customer? Because you get paid on actual results. So delivering good outcomes makes money instead of losing money, which is a pretty fundamental thing. Adam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I've just got a question for you. So I really enjoyed your presentation so far. I totally agree with your philosophy that you've just stated. When you look at this portion of things, my question is like, okay, so if I'm going to like pay for performance to whoever puts together an intervention, there is the question of, the way to, if I have like a promising intervention, say I have a insulation intervention, a really powerful way to get people to insulate their houses is to offer to pay 40% of the cost, right? But so then like, how do I guess it's kind of asking about a chicken and egg problem, right? Like you you want to bring, if you have a promising intervention, you want to bring the savings forward, and you want to get the, say, the T&D utility to sign up for, you know, they're not going to do upgrades, and they'll give you that money, which you'll use to subsidize this promising intervention. So how do you sort of think about that problem?
That's a fabulous question that I probably should have addressed, actually. So getting paid over time. So I guess the first thing I would say is that it's really unique and frankly a little weird that in energy efficiency and utility programs, we're used to getting paid in advance. And so I'm not trying to belittle it. It's still a problem. I'll get to how we solve it. But if you're gonna open a coffee shop, you're gonna have like a model for how many espressos you're gonna sell. But like at the end of the day, you got to rent the building, buy the beans and the whole nine, and you still have to sell the espressos and get paid over time. And so you have to finance it. So same thing with like power plants, right? Like there's this idea of project finance, which is really a synonym of infrastructure finance. And we use it kind of incorrectly. We say like, oh, we're installing a heat pump. That's infrastructure. Like, no, it's not actually. From a finance perspective, if you use credit and asset-based financing, it's actually consumer credit, not infrastructure finance. So the way you build a power plant fundamentally is you're financing a cash flow from selling megawatts to a utility for the next 30 years. And so the definition is like financing infrastructure finance is financing cash flows from infrastructure rather than the credit or asset worthiness of the borrower, right? Which doesn't mean that doesn't factor in, by the way, but like the bulk of it is like, what's the output? So I guess the answer to that question is twofold. One, in general, like regulatorily, you can do this population NMEC, which is the word in California, normalized metered energy consumption. That's the regulation word. But you have to pay at least 50% on performance, which means you can front. And in most markets, some percentage of the forecasted cash flow is being fronted to the aggregator, in the order of 20 or 30% usually. The other answer, which is the long-term answer, is project finance. And so this is really, by the way, just a sample of companies. So if you go to demandflexmarket.com, that's the URL, you can see we've got about 150 aggregators signed up. About half of them are enrolling projects in a market, which is okay, right? Like the transaction cost is low. Not everyone can figure it out. Not everyone's stuff actually pencils, which is fine. But the idea is we're letting folks in to compete. So a number of these companies, especially the ones that have larger portfolios, are working with third-party investors to finance their cash flows and bring that capital forward, which is infrastructure finance. And frankly, it's not that hard. The challenge is like what we call a cold start problem, which is if you don't have data on what your thing does, neither you or anybody else was going to want to finance a potential cash flow. And somehow that's where like things like venture capital and friends and family, and frankly, one of our aggregators, mortgaged his house initially, and then is now financing because he had to get off the ground. And we have a bunch of data and we can help with that. And part of it is everything's gonna cost more and they're not gonna lend you as much, but that's how you do it. You finance the cash flow. And frankly, like Recurve, we even finance our software cash flows. Like it's a really common thing to be able to, it's not that hard to do. We just haven't done it in our corner of the world. And frankly, this is actually, again, about cold start. This is not Recurve's business, but we have some capital. So we're actually, for some of our aggregators, I just signed a contract right before this call that we're fronting some of the capital too, and we get paid back first, just to get them off the ground. It's not really the job we want, honestly, in the market. So that's actually the answer is like, if you're building so I get, it's important actually, our innovation in all of this is we're trying to make flexibility in virtual power plants work like everything else. So we actually think expecting customers to finance their virtual power plant using any sort of credit or asset-based financing is actually a bug, not a feature. That's just not the right way to invest in grid infrastructure. And we're talking about so much money. Like, we co-implement the electrification program here in California, the tech program. But if you do the math just on like residential electrification, it's a $300 billion problem in California, just residential, just electrification implementation. And that stuff, it's not going to come from ratepayer funds. And, credit-based financing is super expensive and has all sorts of equity issues. So I guess that's the answer to the question. And like the good news is, frankly, faster than I ever thought, it's happening, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it seems like the loans program office, for example, is this is what they're trying to do, is basically lower the cost of financing on the.
Yeah, so we know LP, like, and we're definitely talking to LPO there. And this is not there's two sides of the financing. And I'll tell you, they're focused on the consumer end of the financing, which is frankly just more mature and like, because talk to Jigger, I mean, they're looking at really big numbers, right? So they're currently supporting and this is beneficial, but if you're an aggregator and you get a customer, they have to find, let's say the project is going to cost $100,000. It's a commercial project. It turns out 40,000 of that is 40, but there's 40,000 in grid value, right? So now the customer's project, frankly, the aggregator wouldn't transmit all of that 40 grand, but maybe now they're selling them an $80,000 project instead of a $100,000 project, right? So the customer still has to finance $80,000, and that $80,000 on their end of the deal, that is going to be, that's for their comfort and other things. So what LPO is very focused on is saying, well, if you're part of a virtual power plant, we'll reduce the cost of the consumer debt. But they're not yet, they're interested in, but haven't yet wrapped their heads around like the project finance, in part because the market is early and they're looking at bankable assets, and we're not bankable yet. These are specialty lenders and we're just not that big. I mean, I've had these, I don't know. I try to convince Jigger, and then he looks at me and just says, but you just ain't big enough and you're not bankable. And he's right, because they're looking for hundreds of millions of dollars and this market isn't there yet.
Yeah. Well, that's super insightful. I appreciate it.
Cool. And then like I said, what we're doing, this is an example of our MCE flex market, is this combination of paying for long-term flexibility and also event response in a cohesive way. So for example, with MC, we send a long-term price signal based on the avoided cost, and then we send day-ahead rates during emergencies. And the way to think, and this is also an important concept from a VPP standpoint, which is, with MCE is a good example. You can, there's actually a term for it in California. It's called the bifurcation principle, which is a fancy word, but what it means is, if you do demand response or resource adequacy, you can be in the CAISO market, or you can be a VPP selling into the utility. You just can't be both at once. You have to decide. And so we do work with CAISO, but we actually think virtual power plants fit nicer as a hedge for utilities. That what it really is that if you can use your batteries, insulation, heat pumps, and vehicle charging to flatten your load shape, and you can integrate that into your forecast, you're reducing the need of a utility like MCE, which is a community choice aggregator, by long-term capacity. We're hedging, right? We're just flattening the load shape, which means their resource adequacy, their capacity requirement is lower. It saves them money. That's efficiency in the long-term shape change. And during emergency events, if you can get everybody to turn the lights off and crank their thermostat up a few degrees, you just need fewer megawatts, and you've hedged your exposure to $2,000 megawatts in the CAISO. So you can either be on that side as a hedge, and frankly, we do think that's where it fits nicer, or you can be in the market selling demand response as a supply side resource, which is just very complicated and has a lot of barriers and doesn't fully you don't get monetization on things like transmission and distribution values and other things. And the fundamental issue is like the stuff we're doing with virtual power plants is in fact a demand side resource, not a supply side resource. So it's not an easy fit into those markets. And so the last thing, I just want to go to questions here before I totally run the time out. I think we already have, but this is some new data that is worth looking at for flex markets here in California. We have 7 of them running and like 3 more ramping up in Southern California.
We're still on the Home Connect slide.
Oh my gosh, you guys have been totally sharing and not on the right screen. I apologize. That's not ideal. And I have not been showing them to you, apparently. So I don't know if you followed half of what I was just saying. My technical confusion, apologies. Now I imagine you can see this.
Yes.
So these are results of the flex market, the market access, which is a combination of a bunch of markets we're running in California with different vendors, with different utilities, and also the statewide market access program, which was the governor's emergency response I mentioned. And essentially, these numbers are brand new out of the box. I think you're going to see an article about this in one of the industry rags next week. But by sending a price signal and working with, again, there's about 50 of these companies that are really engaged. just these recurve markets has increased the total systems benefit, the grid impact from commercial buildings in California in 12 months by 57%. And each one of the megawatts being delivered is delivering twice the grid benefit as is in the average portfolio in the state. So like if you look at commercial buildings in the efficiency portfolio, the flex market is doubling the value per megawatt. And we are delivering 102% of the forecasted value. Actually, this is also not, I pasted in the wrong slide. These are reversed. I just dropped in right before the meeting, but this is the slightly older thing with this mix up. But so essentially just by doing this, by not picking winners, by opening a market and just sending a price signal, again, in 12 months, we've added 57% to the portfolio. Because the aggregator's incentive is to deliver savings when it's valuable, where we deliver twice the grid impact as average, because the incentive is there to do to actually get paid if you can deliver more. And it's literally right on forecast right now coming into the summer. And so this just represents the kind of scale we can get. Like this is essentially starting from 0 in 12 months. Corey?
Thanks, man. Really appreciate this. I just had a quick question about what you were talking about with project finance. Usually these project finance have non-recourse debt, right? So if the economics of the project were to go bust, the lenders only have access to the assets within the project, but not like the project developer, let's say, right? So if you, I guess presumably you'd be talking about like a recourse project finance idea, just sort of the principle of monetizing cash flows, like future power.
Well, one of the things that these contracts were designed to be in is assignable. So essentially, the aggregator would assign the cash flow to the project finance investor, so they get the money flows through them. And there are within the market, there are rules that manage some of the edge cases. Like if someone installs a massive non-routine event, again, there's rules on how we handle kind of extreme cases. If everything's largely in the bucket, we use large numbers, but sometimes there are massive extremes that we can deal with contractually. So there is that kind of like contractual clarity. But ultimately, the project finance investor is taking those risks into account, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool.
But what we find is that so one of the most important things is that, and those of you familiar with in general, energy efficiency is if you're realizing 70% of forecast, you're doing pretty damn well, actually. And we see efficiency programs sometimes, like we're not shocked when we see sub 50% performance. So, and that's what we found here is that every one of our flex markets that's pay for performance is hitting essentially on the order of 100% realization rate, sometimes more, because the incentive is to not over predict and be accurate. And often the first year, it's not uncommon to see 60%, but year 2, they're at 100% because they calibrate their expectations to reality. Because most folks who are in the market have never seen real data. Not everybody's fault. It's really hard to come by, right? And so frankly, we've seen, these markets go from 60% realization rate to 100%. It took 12 months. So like when we're fronting some of the capital, like we'll say like, okay, we'll give you 30% of your forecast up front, we get paid back first. We're not in the finance business. We're just unlocking some aggregators that just don't have they have projects they want to build but don't have the balance sheet. That's not our real job, for what it's worth.
That's really cool. I hadn't heard of that business model. That's pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, and all I'm saying in general is, and I'm not criticizing because I'm right there with everybody, but if you've been living in energy efficiency in the demand side, we get kind of, I call it, it's a religion. I was in the religion. But if you back away a little bit and say, how is this done everywhere else? And apply those same principles, that's what we're trying to do. With the one gap being, this isn't even a gap either, but you can't have a market without a product. So if we're calculating our product, we better start there. And, we got to agree on if we can agree on what the math is, then everything else can line up around it in the same way as every other resource and every other power plant. Nick, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I have to unmute two different things. Thanks, Matt.
No
I'm
problem.
interested in consolidating, aggregating climate resilience districts. That's a little different than a CCA. Operates inside the CCA, but has municipal-owned resources. And this is to be able to use some of these grid values to finance some of the municipal infrastructure like PV for the water treatment and that sort of stuff.
Right.
And I just like kind of your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, the trick is looking around the room and saying, you know, if we reduce peak, who benefits from it, right? You need a counterparty.
Right.
So frankly, there are municipal projects that are being bid into these flex markets, you know, already.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, you know, if you're doing something to reduce GHGs or capacity or energy values in a municipality, is looking to your CCA or utility. You know, why should the municipality be investing in something that is going to reduce the T&D costs to PG&E or something and not get paid for it? So that's the first thing, is just like looking around saying like, who's benefiting from these investments that should actually be contributing to
Right.
And frankly, our markets are like, we have CCAs, we've got IOUs, and we've also got what are called in California regional energy networks, who are also creating markets. So for example, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura County down here, they're part of the 3C REN, the Central Coast Regional Energy Network. And they're paying for a combination of things that they care about. One is the resource value, but we're actually, if you are in a hard to reach community, we are jacking up and paying additional for the value of gas reductions to essentially make, and that additional payments that we're making on gas reductions to the low income community, you know, that's not cost effective virtual power plant, that's equity. And we stack the values, right? And so they're getting grid value, but they're paying more for it because they're helping low income customers also, which is great.
Cool.
There are, so in terms of white papers and the likes, we do a lot of writing. We do have one white that's called that I think is in on our blogs. It's the title of the blog actually is the secret plan for decarbonization. But we do a lot of writing actually. So I would actually recommend, generally, more so than white papers, you'll find a ton of blogs and like technical content on our blog on the Recurve website. That's where I recommend going. That covers a lot of these topics. We don't exactly have like one big compendium, but it's all there. We like to be really transparent.
Thanks, Matt.
Any other questions? I know we're kind of getting to the end of the run here, time-wise. And I apologize for not showing slides through the second half. I was using them, and that certainly probably didn't make that easier to follow. I was on the not switching decks.
It was still great. Yeah, no worries on that. If there are no more questions,
I'll take a question.
This also links to our website, but on our homepage. But we keep the Flex Market stuff is on demandflexmarket.com versus the Recurve website. It's just like a sister property. It is on our homepage. It links out from there. But if you're looking for more information about the Flex Markets themselves, we just host them separately.
Thanks, Matt. This has been really super helpful. Gonna have to watch the whole thing again, I think. As more supply resources show up behind the meter, such as batteries, vehicles, how do you see this landscape changing? Or do you think that it's still mainly for each household to try to shape their load? Is that where you still see the most value?
Well, I do think there's an open question when you get to certain types of resources that can be sub-metered actually, and like you can kind of, so we can either include EV charging, for example, in the load of the house, or if we can get the data. But the operative word is if, by the way. Like you could also isolate it, though EVs are actually especially interesting because what's your baseline when you're trying to measure like how do EVs change? Like it's a challenge. This is an active area of research. So there's an open area, but like one of our challenges is, in like, for example, in the Caltrack 3.0 methods that are about to start. If you're interested in nerding out with us, please do, because we've developed, like, joke about rocket science and stuff like that, but we have all my data science team is, and some of them might be here, but it's a bunch of astrophysicists actually. But we're about to do some really cool stuff to like disaggregate solar load, because going in, I was like, let's just get the solar data. It's all being monitored. But one thing those of you who probably deal with data know is that like way easier said than done. And so like anything that we can do with something like smart meter data, where we can get the data in one place and avoid having to get bespoke data from vendors, is really to our advantage. Because even where we're just trying to deal with, I won't name names, but big companies who are highly motivated to get us the data so that we can pay them, it's kind of like pulling teeth, and it's really hard. And so a lot of this idea of like, we'll have like big centralized DERMs that control everything. Like I understand the theory, but in practice, I'm highly skeptical, because like we live in this world and it's really hard to get this kind of data out of folks. And it comes in as apples and oranges. We don't know where it came from. Not, you know, so I get that there's a big gap between theory and practice when you start talking about getting lots and lots of data from devices. Vic?
Yes, thanks, Matt. This has been great. When you determine, well, working with your baseline, you focused in on the thermostat.
Yes.
To do all your calculations. Do you see a benefit if you were able to disaggregate in real time every single load within the environment, and then be able to aggregate that against a smart meter to give you that exact, what you just said now, really hard to get all that data with DRs integrated?
So there's certainly cool stuff that we could do, and do, by the way, getting behind the meter data about devices, but it's less useful than it seems on its face. So let's say we know what a smart meter is, a smart thermostat is doing, and we know it, which we sometimes do, by the way, like we do get that data sometimes. But from a measurement standpoint, we don't know what it's replacing. So that smart thermostat doesn't give us the baseline condition of what would the building do without a smart thermostat. It's telling us what the building does with a smart thermostat, which is information that's interesting, but doesn't actually help us measure. And it also doesn't necessarily know if it's connected to a 2-ton or a 4-ton air conditioner, for example. So we don't actually know what it's doing, or how efficient that system is, or if their ducts are all disconnected, and what it's actually doing to demand. We just know what it's turning on and off potentially, but increasingly it's variable speed and very complicated too. So there's interesting stuff you can do with that data, but we like to think of that data as metadata that an aggregator will want to join with the performance data to extract information, right? And understand how cause and effect, when I do this, what does it do to the meter? So it's not useless by any means, but for the level of complexity and again, it just doesn't really solve the measurement problem. Because again, measurement is all about what would have happened if you hadn't have changed the building, and the telemetry we're getting is almost always what's now happening after you've changed the building.
But isn't the objective here is to work off the available capacity and to mitigate what you said earlier, the build outs and the reliance on all these huge resources, by way of being able to control intelligently on each individual. Like take a home, for instance.
Yep.
Every home is unique. Everyone has their own energy lifestyle. Okay. To be able to, in real time, be able to control that, and not so much as comparing it to a baseline. I mean, you're controlling that for the impact now in terms of those peak periods, high periods.
So let me so control and like DERM systems and all of that are critically important. It's a matter of where they live.
Yeah.
And so you're exactly right that everybody's different, and every house is different with different preferences and different devices and different everything. So we would just say what we focus on is sending a price signal to an aggregator. Maybe that's Ohm Connect or Leap, or maybe it's Clear Result, or any number of folks. We think fundamentally, and again, when I say this is a lot like, it's not universal. There's a lot of different ways to skin the cat, but the DERM system and the control should live at that aggregator, right? And saying, I want to work with Ohm Connect. They're going to control my stuff. They know me. They're good at it. I've chosen to work with them. And if we say peak, save a lot during peak, then they'll come in and turn my stuff off that I've connected to them, right? And they make the control decisions. Because remember, like, I don't know about you guys, but like, I frankly fight my DR. Like, I notice when DR is happening because my house isn't comfortable. Like, I find myself at my thermostat realizing I'm in an event pretty often. You know, it's not, you know, we got to remember there's nothing in a building, particularly a house, but there's nothing in a building that is a grid resource. All of it is for your comfort or your kids doing their homework and the lights and whatever, right? So I guess my philosophical approach is focus at the meter where the buildings intersect with the grid, measure the impact there, pay for the impact, and let, you know, the market and customers decide how to address it. And you'll
But the customers have no means.
Well, that's where
ohm control is going to control, and that becomes very intrusive.
Well, maybe, but I can also decide who I work with as a customer, or if I work with them at all, right? And the good companies balance how intrusive they are, right? Because they don't want to lose me as a customer. Whereas I don't necessarily trust utilities to have that perspective from my experience necessarily. If they're, you know, a good example is like heat pumps create winter morning peaks. And I've heard this like, oh, we'll just keep your bedroom warm all night. And I'm like, I don't set my bedroom temperature for your damn grid. Like, that's my favorite example is like, is the utility going to tell me what temperature I sleep in my bedroom in? Like, is that, where's the edge of the dang monopoly? Right.
Well, they'd want to. I mean, just like, I mean, if Home Connect, you know, controlled it, they would ultimately want to as well.
Yes, but it's just a matter of, like I said, I don't have to let them. And if it's Home Connect, I could say, you know, whatever. I don't want to pick on Home Connect. We love Home Connect. We love all these things. But I'll do work with Ecobee, or I'll jump over here. I'll just turn you off. You know, like whatever. I have choice.
So I guess the heart of this is if you were given the best of both worlds to be able to work within with the proper tools, would you see an advantage?
Wait, I'm missing
to your goals here in terms of having the consumer participate in a non-intrusive way by letting the air conditioner and the heat pump run by compensating the other loads. If you had the tools to be able to access those loads in relation to an event that's occurring or a price.
So I guess I think that like in the role that Recurve is trying to play and in a healthy market, we want to separate these things, right? And so like we as a company, like our goal is to be, you know, we're like Standard & Poor's and NASDAQ and like Bloomberg on the back end. We're not ever going to touch a customer directly because that is essentially interfering with the channel. And so I believe that sending a good price signal and letting the market have access to that signal and compete for customers will deliver the innovative solutions that we need to scale virtual power plants, and will optimize ultimately for the correct balance between customer benefit and grid benefit, which is going to be maybe different in every building with every customer, right? And so, you know, that's, you know, I think a lot in efficiency, people, oh, you're going to confuse customers. I'm like, I don't know, like you own a cell phone, you bought a car, you picked out a shirt this morning. Like, when is consumer choice ultimately a bad thing? So that would be my perspective. Obviously, there's a lot in the middle. Adam, do you have something?
Yeah, I just had another question that came to mind, which is like sort of intersection. So like suppose that party A has an insulation, you know, solution, and party B has a heat pump or air conditioning solution. How do you, you know, and they're operating independently, but they both are seeking financing to, you know, to compensate for their investment. These things are kind of overlapping and working together, right? Like the building envelope affects like how efficient the air conditioning is and how much of it can be, how effective pre-cooling can be, for example. So how would you think about the measurement in that scenario?
So, you know, there are ways to parse it out, but fundamentally we're focused at the meter, right? So that there is someone who like ultimately owns that meter's impact. And this is a challenge, right? This is one of the trade-offs, which means if you want to if you want to work with a thermostat vendor, you have to kind of, we do have ways to isolate, but frankly, it's more of a contractual mechanism. Like you would have a sub agreement with your thermostat vendor that says, here, I'm going to pay you, if that makes sense. And again, we have certain loads that we can isolate for, but like a lot of it blends together. Like frankly, nobody looking at the energy bills knows the difference between what the thermostat did, what your insulation did, what are your duct losses, and what's your, what's the result of your bad charge in your air conditioner. It all looks like a bunch of it's all merged together in HVAC load, from a load standpoint. So that's one of the challenges, is that like we can't, you 4 vendors go into a, but that's also like, honestly, like we don't know the difference. Nobody seems, it's just the math, right? It's all affecting HVAC load. So with some exceptions,
I can see, as long as you don't, as long as your net payment doesn't exceed the net value, then the payer is made whole. It's just a question of like, who benefits, who pays, basically.
And we do see this role, like we call super aggregators, which are companies coming in and saying, we're going to own the customer and the cash flow, and we're going to work with a bunch of different vendors, and we will measure those vendors, and they can have contracts and how they pay the vendors. Some of it is just agreements, like here's how we're going to parse it, right? Because like we can't necessarily parse between thermostat and insulation, right? Like in the math that we do, it all looks like HVAC savings. And so that's where contracts come in. This is one of the challenges. This is an actual challenge. Like we don't have a super elegant way to just do it. It's, trade-offs.
Michael, you wrote a question. Maybe you would take that last.
Oh,
I'd read it. Yeah, do incumbent
EE providers. Yeah, so do incumbent EE providers see this as a threat? How do I address that? So it's both a threat and a huge opportunity, right? I think that we see companies like, we have folks like Clear Results and Franklin really active, doing some really innovative stuff actually in these markets, but it is also a threat to this traditional, we're going to win a utility program, get, half of the admin costs going to flow through us, et cetera, business model. So it's a bit challenging, right? Like, but I think in general, we're increasingly seeing that the writing's on the wall, and, energy efficiency funding is generally not going up, it's going down, and the grid is changing. So the ones that are really thinking ahead, it's still challenging, but recognize that like traditional energy efficiency programs aren't actually solving the problems we need to solve and are not that lucrative. And, pivoting, because energy efficiency is capacity that you just haven't bothered to measure necessarily, can make them more money and is more scalable. But it's certainly an issue. The energy efficiency community is, strong and entrenched, but, we think, sometimes we get blamed, but I think we're creating a life raft more or less, right? Which is, the efficiency ship is slowly but surely becoming less and less relevant. However, energy efficiency may be dead, but long live energy efficiency. It's actually just flexibility we haven't measured. It's more valuable often than we give it credit for. And I think whoever EB is, I don't know if that's an Eric or whatever, but yes, it's viewed as while it does eat some of the current lunch, this is a much bigger market with much more potential. So I agree that I think if you're smart, like this scales, and we're not going to get the $1 trillion plus investment we need by taxing ratepayers and funding programs. Like that just doesn't work. So we think we can get there if we can tap into procurement budgets and utilize private capital and market innovation. So much bigger market.
Well, Matt, thanks so much. This was super informative.
Hey, Eric, I did get the E right. There aren't that many E names. Eric Bornstein's question. I only see acronyms. So yeah, very much appreciate the time today. I know we've kind of exceeded it.
Any parting thoughts or anything you want to promote?
Stay in touch. If you're interested in this approach, even if you're not in California, we're trying to get out of California. We think, again, this is kind of an operating system, and so whatever kind of things you do in the market, we think, again, putting in place a back end for virtual power plants that has the same attributes as traditional power plants, or frankly, car loans or mortgage-backed securities is just a necessary stepping stone, and that's really what we're trying to do. It's technical and nerdy, but there's an analogy for every single thing we're doing if you go and look at how solar securitized, for example. So appreciate the good questions today, and feel free to, my email, by the way, is matt@recurve.com. It's a hard one, so if you have any thoughts or questions, you can always feel free to reach out and stay in touch. Appreciate the time.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.